Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to CPA Academy. My name is Lady Maya, and I'm happy to welcome you into today's webinar on Diversity and Inclusion One-on-One, Organizational System Awareness. On your screen, you will see our two presenters soon enough, Jina and Angelo. And before we get started, I want to go through some housekeeping items and do some technical checks to make sure everything is working. First, if you don't mind going over to the GoToWebinar questions panel, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen. Please let me know that you can hear me and see the slides on your screen, and feel free to let me know where you're listening in from. If anyone is having any technical trouble, please let me know in that questions panel. Please keep in mind that there are quite a few of you, and I'll do my best to get around to each of you as quickly as I can. All right, let's see where everyone is listening in from. Colorado Springs, Orlando, Albuquerque, Beaver, Utah, Dallas, Texas, Greenville, South Carolina. Fantastic. Hello, Pennsylvania. Now that I know everything is working, let's go through some housekeeping for credit. This is a 1-hour webinar and qualifies for 1 CPE credit. The way you earn that credit is fairly straightforward. Just stay logged in for 50 minutes of our allotted time and answer the poll questions. We'll have a total number of 4 polls during today's webinar, and to earn full credit, you'll need to answer at least 3 of those polls. CPE will be issued by the end of the day today and will be available in your CPA Academy account. I also want to let you know that we are recording today's webinar, and the archive will be made available to you by the end of the day as well. Soon enough, I will send a link in the chat so you can download today's presentation materials, and they can also be found in your My CPA Academy account page. And now that we're all set, let's turn today's fantastic webinar over to our presenters. We're going to start off with Jina. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Lady Maya, and welcome everybody to another AI 101. I'm joined today by Angelo Torrez. We're going to be talking about organizational system awareness. That's the title. Angelo, you should show up now. Aha, there you are.
Right on cue.
I'm flipping my camera around, but hopefully you can still hear me. I know we talk a lot about organizations and systemic, issues, but we don't talk about systems. And so yay for Angelo joining us to talk about that today. By the way, I heard windy Albuquerque when somebody said where they were coming in from, and hello to whoever's in DC because I'm in Maryland, so we're neighbors. Anyway, so Angelo, you see his bio here on the screen. Angelo is an industrial organizational psychologist and a vocational counselor. He has 10 years experience in workforce development. He also supports organizational change and cultural development with an emphasis on workforce development and DEI. I'm really excited about today's conversation. So Angelo, thank you so much for agreeing to be a guest.
Thank you for that introduction. And as you kind of stated already, I am an industrial organizational psychologist. I started out working with marginalized populations, helping them to obtain or maintain or gain in their employment. And throughout my work, I started to notice some systems develop, some that are conducive and help people to enter and re-engage in the work system, and others that were a little bit debilitating and really set people up at a disadvantage. And that's where it really all got started, was what were those systems in place and how were they organized in such a way to promote some while keeping and holding others back. So I'm very excited to be able to talk to you about that today.
And when we first started talking about this conversation, I think one of the questions I usually ask my guests is, what is it about this that really makes it important? I mean, why? Why do we need to have this conversation?
Yeah, I think for myself personally, these are things that I know that I've experienced when we talk about systematic oppression, when we talk about just systems and even promoting and helping move people up into the workforce. Like I said, when I first started working with people to enter the workforce, it became quickly apparent that there was a prototype, a type, or an archetype, so to say, of a qualified candidate, what they look like, how they present. And when I try to distill that down to help people to get into the workplace, it kind of keeps coming back to a common denominator. Mm-hmm. And that was one thing that, I've noticed it showing up in Well, when we talk about systems, I've seen it showing up in different ways as far as there's race, the way people look, there's gender, and it just kind of continues and builds up all the way up to different varying socioeconomic statuses. But the impact is felt at different levels and to varying degrees. And I really, believe in an equitable workforce, and I want to help create win-win relationships for both businesses and their workforce. So to help them move toward a common goal. And that was one thing I had noticed is more or less missing today in some of our workforce, in some of the fields more than others.
So you provided a couple of slides. You want to walk through those real quick before we jump into the main conversation?
Yeah. So the first one, I believe, is definitions. I think it's important for us a little bit to understand, when we talk about organizations, systems, and how those two come together to create an organizational system, right? These are things that both help build up and point us in the same direction, but they also help set parameters and boundaries, right? When we look at CPAs and accountants, we're saying, hey, we're focusing on this area, right? We're not going into marketing. We're not going into these other fields. That organization, that system, is built up to create a structure that helps say, here's what we do. Here's the things that we don't do. But as we go and look at some of these things, and we'll get into it, right now, is that those systems are built on certain references, framework, or biases and stereotypes. And I know those can be somewhat loaded questions, but really when I talk about those things, I'm really pointing to, is there something unconscious that has helped filling or fueling the way that we're perceiving and acting upon those things? So on top of that, systems, right, we'll go into systemic things here. And those systemic is made up of these three components, right? Individualized, things that we hear, things that we've seen or interacted with personally. Interpersonal, the way that we treat others and the way that we take those internalized things and act upon them. And institutional, things that are larger than a single point of view or a single person, but they're set up to predict and help set the framework for how whatever that organized system is going to be. So when we talk about systemic, these are the three things that we're pointing to. How is it impacting individuals, the way individuals work together, and the organizations that they're within?
So first of all, I just want everybody to know the slides are over there, so I'm not ignoring you. I'm looking at the slides. And I would also invite our attendees, if you have questions as we go along, go ahead and drop them in. I'll be monitoring the Q&A and might throw some questions at you if that's okay, Angelo.
Yeah.
We'll also hold some, of course, to the Q&A at the end. So on the last slide, actually, let me go back to it. So on the last slide, you talked about internalized, interpersonal, and institutional. But often we think about it solely in terms of institutional. And I've heard about internalized where I sort of have bought into those systems. So as a woman, for example, I might buy into those stereotypes and feel like, and not even notice that I'm following along in them. But can you explain interpersonal a little more?
Yeah, so interpersonal can probably be, one of the easiestly relatable aspects would be race, right? And I'm going to go into, again, another definition that I actually don't have written up here for race, but when we talk about race and when race is mentioned, we are purely focusing on phenotype, only the things that you can visually see, only outward characteristics that are observed by yourself, the way others observe you, and the way that you see others observing yourself. Those three things, right? And as you mentioned before, right, there's differences between males and females, especially in the workforce, and we can just look to the wage gap to see those differences. And that's some of those interpersonal things, right? The way that we may view others, the way that we may judge or promote or demote some people purely based on the way they look, or some of those outward objectives that don't necessarily hinge or hang on any real personable skills. It's just, like I said, purely visual, purely outward.
Right. I see you. I make assumptions about you. Therefore, I apply then those assumptions to you and everything in terms of the systems and the behaviors, etc.
Yeah, right. And then that's when we move into some of the institutionalized things. We build upon those internal biases and those internal framework and structure that we've built for ourselves. And this happens, organizationally in a workforce. The way that this looks or is represented is the way that we view, hire, and promote candidates, right? So you can skip to, I think, 2 slides over maybe, and there's some of the top 10 or top 8 traits for someone going into CPA. And before you even maybe skip over, just think to yourself, right? Yeah, what might those be? Reading and comprehension, math, active listening. These are some of the top skills. So there's some biases, stereotypes built into kind of every system, and they're helpful, and at the same time they can be hurtful depending on how they're managed and how they're utilized, right? So this would be one of those institutionalized, individual, interpersonal things that we may look or see in accounting or CPAs, right? We're going to say we're looking for someone who's good at reading and comprehension. We're looking for someone who's excels in math. They're able to listen to their customers and think about their problems critically and make problem-solving decisions. And those are all create kind of this archetype, so to say, for who's going to be the best person to go into accounting.
Right. When we were, I don't know if this is right on time here, but I'm looking at a chart. The chart says we're analyzing data. I know that algorithms are biased, but you also talked about when we were in our previous calls, you talked about data. And data reveals bias, but a lot of people think data is just data.
Yeah. So, and we'll just kind of dial it back here because we also were talking, I think, or what led into that was the original framework for what a business is, right? And when we look at what a business is, we're saying it's something that makes, buys, sells, or promotes a service or product for a profit, right? And throughout history, we have these examples of what is a strong business, what does a strong or competitive company look like, and what are those things built upon, so that if you're going to start your own business or if you're trying to improve yours, typically we look to some of the things in the past and try to replicate or recreate or build upon to create something, right? And those systems and biases, when we kind of recreate and return those same ideas, can create the same revolving doors or the same issues, more to say less, the same issues within the workforce that we're seeing today, where we're looking at these top skills and we're trying to identify who are these top skills and top accountants that we want to hire, who are going to come out of a CPA graduate program and we want to promote. And when we look at the data, we can say, hey, top skills, those are all internal. None of those are external. But when we look at some of the data to say, is that what we're actually doing? Are those the key things that we're actually measuring and looking for? And the data would somewhat suggest otherwise.
I'm looking at this chart again now, and to your point, these are the things we say are the skills you need to have, but we make assumptions about whether or not people have those skills based on what group they're in. I also know that we evaluate their competency in actually performing differently. Women are judged more harshly than men, and so are people of color. And, well, pretty much all minorities. And if I understand what you're saying, in the accounting profession alone, first, the accountants and the CPAs were all men. And they were all white.
Yeah.
And women became CPAs, although there were some barriers. Women could pass the exam but couldn't get licenses at the beginning. And so they were eventually issued licenses, allowed to practice. And now we know, you have it in here, statistic, roughly.
It's pretty close to half.
Half of the graduates are women, but only 23% of partners are women. So the systems were designed and they're modeled after and have continued to evolve based on Caucasian men.
Yeah.
And so that means everything else is all the cards are stacked against us? Because I think organizations are really trying to work on D&I. So
yeah, and I wouldn't. Yeah, the cards are stacked against minority populations, and they do it in a varying degree in various ways. So looking at these top skills in accounting, and we look at some of those institutional systemic issues that we see, right? There's positive and there's negative biases. For myself, Mexican American, Chicano, something I've heard is, you're either really lazy or you're really hardworking. And where do those things play in, right? And for CPAs, we see here, we're looking at top skills, and I think we would all assume math, and there's some stereotypes about the Asian culture and how they excel in areas of math, right?
mm-hmm.
So we would expect to, if we're going purely based off some of this data and some of the top skills, we would say, okay, maybe Asians should be more partners in firms. Maybe they should be excelling in these areas. Women tend to have pretty strong reading comprehension and active listening skills. Those are all top skills that we should also see somewhat reflected in the demographic. And as we look at the data and pour through, we can really see how these systems have evolved. And it's not to say that it's any, and I think that's the big thing with when we talk about systemic issues, is that it's not necessarily an individual. It's not necessarily even the group of people. Sometimes it's people just acting off of these internal biases and perpetuating them without giving real consideration to, is this the best way to do business? Is this the best that we can be? It may be better than what we were doing previously, but there's still room to go.
Sorry, my dog moved and I was afraid he was going to start making sounds. So sorry about that, folks. You have this slide in here. Oops, that's the wrong one. Clearly, I don't know how to run PowerPoint anymore. So you have this slide here. I was looking for it. The myth about Asians, math, should be more partners. Interestingly enough, if you look at the AICPA Trends Report, after white or Caucasian, the next biggest group of partners are Asians, or in Pan-Asian.
Pan-Asian.
And so it's interesting that you say that, because is that a coincidence?
I believe it partly is. And I don't think that's, again, it goes back to some of those biases, the way that we review, interpret, and we're judging people. And in the working world, the one thing we hear is, who's going to be a good fit for this position, right?
Yes.
And when someone uses good fit, how do you measure a good fit? What's a quantifiable measure that you can assign to someone if you're purely just going off of someone's fit, right? That means you're defaulting back to, what are some ingrained systems or ingrained biases that we've already heard? Who makes a strong partner? Who's going to be a good from partner? Who's going to go into a CFO role? And you're right, they do represent one of the larger populations, and some of that scales back down to the education where students are receiving their schooling at, who's accepting those applicants, and how they're being encouraged or promoted to go into any one of these industries. And in CPAs and accounting, it's generally been a generational profession, meaning that for the most part, for a long time, you either knew someone, or you had a close family member, or it was a direct relative who actually exposed you to the world of accounting and what it may be like to actually progress and move through the ranks in an upward mobility.
It's interesting you say that, because I also think some of it could be the school or the college you went to, and the level of prestige and awareness to business degrees. And then in addition to business degrees, then an accounting degree. And I know that in some minority communities, different types of professions they're more aware than others. So, for example, accounting isn't necessarily something that people are aware of in the African American community as much as they would be medicine or lawyers and that kind of thing. Or some cultures might value lawyers and engineers, say, more than doctors. So it's just, there's that cultural influence as well.
Yeah, there's definitely the external cultural awareness and promoting of certain ideologies and, contributing to your own society and those types of things. And that's great. But at the same time, when we come back and look at some of the data, we can see that how many people are enrolling into these programs, how many of them are successfully completing these programs, and then how many of them are actually moving upwards or around in a positive way.
Right.
And that's what we're seeing here. When we look again at the data for Asians, it's 17%. 17% of all firms are made up of Asians, but only 4% are going to be partners.
Right.
And for the other minorities, Hispanic, Latin, and Black, we see those numbers, drop down even less than half for some.
Precipitously. By the way, you used a term, and I wrote it down because I wanted to ask. This isn't about language. You referred to yourself as Chicano. I feel like if I said that word, that would have been considered a slur. Now, I get that I'm derailing the conversation a bit, but when it comes to talking about D&I, sometimes the language itself gets.
And I live in Colorado, right along the Rocky Mountains. My family has actually been here for, dates back to 500 years. I'm not indigenous or Native American, even though we would kind of qualify as indigenous. But technically, we would be a group who's been here, and the border moved before we did. So we stayed on this side of America. And these are some of our own institutional and biases, right? If I was in Texas, I might be a Tex-Mex. If I was in Florida, I may be Cuban. If I was in the East Coast, I might be Puerto Rican, just based on, again, these visual characteristics, maybe minus the beard and stuff.
And so I just saw a question come in, and I think all of us, Lady Maya, Angelo, and myself, we should go into timeout immediately because we did not start with a polling question. We are so
I was wondering,
fired by our attendee.
I was waiting in suspense, like, when is it coming? All right. The first poll question is now on your screen. It says, how would you rate the diversity of your current place of employment? And your options are listed.
So I did not catch the name of that person who put that in there, but thank you. You get a bonus point for reminding us all. Angelo, you wanted to ask this question about the rate, about diversity in the organizations. It's interesting because in previous percentages, webinars, we talked about how diverse it is. But now you're asking people to perceive essentially the level of diversity. Is there a difference between perception and so what people perceive is very diverse versus what the data tells us, or does it usually line up?
I think it's different, right? And that's going to go back to kind of the meaning of what your perception is, because a lot of, I wouldn't say, I'll go with a lot, comes back down to exposure, right? How exposed are you to other people in your organization that are different from yourself? Are you working in a homogeneous population where everyone looks similar to you? And maybe that's just because you're in one section of the building, one office, or how much exposure are you actually to everyone in the organization that makes up the diversity that we're seeing? And I think that's, diversity is a number, but it also has a real impact, especially when you see things like how many people are moving up, how many mid-level managers, how many executive level. What's the diversity there? Board levels are notorious for being very homogeneous. It's one class. It's usually middle-aged white males. And, we definitely, and you need something like diversity or a number on it to be able to actually, point to the fact that, hey, it doesn't make sense for so many qualified people to not actually be represented at all at the highest level of some of these companies.
So I saw a request, and so Lady Maya, I think I'm going to do this right there so we can see the poll results. It was 18% very diverse, 24% diverse, 41% somewhat diverse, 15% not diverse. So it's interesting. What you just touched on, Angelo, got me thinking about where you are in the country. So am I in the Chicago office, or am I in an office in Wichita or Salt Lake City?
Yeah.
I might perceive the level of diversity differently. But as we get to this more distributed workforce, right, because of COVID, increase in hiring people without needing to come into the office, that's going to change too.
Yeah, it's definitely going to change not only the perception, but also the way that we're viewing some of those other characteristics, right? Team building or being able to work collaboratively with other people and how we're doing those things. So I think the remote work and the hybrid model poses its own kind of, can of worms to kind of be opened up and dissected on its own, but it's still, when we look at these things, we're still going to come back to what is the data actually supporting and promoting, because that's where the rubber hits the road, is who are the people doing the work.
So I am a woman. I am a woman of color. If I'm in an organization that is, someone here said 15% said not diverse, are there particular things I should be looking for in terms of the practices? How do I identify that there might be something in the way our system in my organization is designed that I can start to ask questions about? Does that make sense?
A little bit. I think if you're in one of those positions where it's pretty prevalent that it's not very diverse and there isn't someone else to look to, laterally, typically you'd look up, right, to say, who are those people in the higher positions who are in some of those authority positions to make big moves, right, to actually hire people, to who selects the interns, what schools do we go to find these people? Those are the questions that we're wanting to ask, right? It doesn't have to be, what are we doing to fix this? It could just be, hey, where are we sourcing our talent from?
Right. And
who, especially in an organization, who's getting promoted and why are they getting promoted?
So if I'm in an organization, I love the fact that if I look laterally, I can see there are other people of color. But when I look at management, I might see a few, but not a lot. And then I get all the way to the C-suite, for example, and there's none. And I'm thinking, well, maybe it's a recruiting issue. I went to an HBCU. Hey, we're not recruiting at an HBCU. So I can go to the HR team and say, why aren't we? It's a way to start to interrupt the system inside.
Absolutely. And I think
let me just...
Yeah, I think that's, one, you have to be at an organization that has at least that level of, psychological safety where you can bring up some of those questions. But at the same time, if you're looking laterally and you're seeing a lot of people who are of varying demographics and you look up and it's just one, that's where you're going to want to ask, right? And I think the way you presented that was great by saying, hey, here's where, I'm a qualified person. I'm doing this job. Obviously, you thought well enough to put me in this position. Here's my background. Here's the school I went to. Here's where I interned, right? And here's where some other people went to school and where they interned at. And again, we're helping define and set a new standard for the way that we identify, promote, and support our workforce. And it's not just based on some of these organizational systems that are perpetuated, right? We go to the same schools, we go to the same people, or we look to the same or for the same indicators that are going to promote success. We go back to that good fit. That's the whole point of this, right? Is to try to move away from a blanket statement like this person isn't a good fit and actually identify, well, who is the good fit and what makes them a good fit?
Skills and competencies. But, the accounting profession hasn't always been one that looks at skills and competencies. And for a lot of reasons. I mean, if a lot of our work is analytical, and doing the work proves you have the skills. So how do I identify the mix of skills that will help me assess somebody if some of it is performative? Is it a catch? And it's a bit of a catch-22. And so it lends itself maybe to going back to the same schools, because I'm assuming people from that school are qualified or that have certain GPAs, because I'm assuming that if you have GPA, you're qualified. So I'm focusing on the wrong things then, because it seems like a reasonable thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's very reasonable, and it's a slice of the pie. You're taking out of everyone here, we're looking at this one slice that represents where my background came from, how I walked into this position, and what I did or who helped me to move into these positions without actually, like you know, the way you even open that up, this is a very analytical, technical job. It's very quantifiable. So if someone has the skills to do it, they should be able to do the job. Yet the data doesn't support that. It doesn't show this even line or even close to really even demographics of those who are qualified candidates. And again, when we go back to that AICPA data there, you can see how many people are enrolling, how many people are going into these programs, and how many people are completing them. And then you just see this shift in data from, you know, a diverse CPAs to those who are actually coming out.
So I asked that question sort of tongue in cheek because I also know that GPAs are not an indication of success.
Not at all.
And yet we rely on GPAs in the absence of something else that feels vaguer. It feels more, that's not even a word, vaguer. Which gets me to something. I wrote this down when we had a conversation. You wrote something about the archer in the Olympics. Do you remember what that was?
Yeah. So when we were talking about that, we were saying, how are we identifying goals and what are our targets, right? And we'll use that GPA example, right? The GPA would be something that we're referencing as a tool to make a good assumption. But when we really break that down, what does it take to actually get a good GPA, right? It's going to be time on task. It's going to be someone who's following through and someone who's committed to something, right? And it's really important to have that as specific targets along the way and not necessarily our end goal, right? So for organizations, when I mentioned the archer, you know, we look at like the Olympics, right? Your goal as an archer is to go get the gold medal. And to do that, you need to hit the target along the way at every point. So sometimes we'll use this good fit GPA as our goal when really that's just one target and one measurement that's going to help us to find that qualified candidate or whoever is going to be the best quote unquote fit, right?
So
made up of those small targets.
Conflating target and goal.
Yeah. And when we do that, you know, these are things that every human does, right? Our brain wants to take the path of least resistance. That's why we use organizations. That's why we use systems. And that's how systematic devices work. We want to take the path of least resistance. And when we say or do things like, oh, this person's a good fit, we're defaulting back to those ingrained, you know, oftentimes uncommunicated factors that we really haven't even delved into. Say, hey, why does GPA, or why would you even think that a higher GPA would make someone more successful?
So there's another polling question before we go to the second one. It talks about organizational structures and systems. Can you just list off a couple of those structures? I know, for example, I think HR recruiting is a structure or a process. Are there other structures that people can think of as they're thinking about this polling question?
Yeah. So again, right, the structure is arrangement of how two things are relating or working together. You know, oftentimes building something bigger than themselves. And there's all kinds of different structures or institutions. We have the legal area, we have the legal institution or judicial system. We have the educational institution. We have corporate institutions. And the way that these are often built or moved forward, you know, are typically, you know, little moves at a time, but they're based on some of the same previous, you know, institutionalized structures that were there before.
So if you think about anything that is a process that's defined in an organization, how things are decided, how changes are made, or the series of steps it takes to do something, those are the systems you're talking about.
Yeah, and yes, so the systems would be the things that we are doing, and also the exclusion of those things we aren't doing, right?
Right.
So it serves two purposes, is so that the ink doesn't run out of the lines. You want to keep everything inside so that you can hopefully go create a system that is repetitive, reproducible, and accomplishes the same goal. So it's a very much a systems approach when you look at it. It's not just one piece or one part of it. It's how those all work together. So again, when we look at accounting and CPA, we can take it back farther and say, okay, right, what is the educational system that's feeding into this corporate system, right? How are those two things working together, and how are they built to promote some people over others?
So we're looking at the results here. It's 17% annually, which is good. 17% quarterly, 7% monthly, 26% not on a set schedule but regularly. And 30% are not sure.
So, and the way you would know this, right, is saying if your organization's talking about what are those missions, values, goals, what's the hierarchy here, what are teams made up of, how are those things communicated, and even down to project management, how do we look at setting up a new goal, deciding who's going to run it and what's going to feed into that. All those things combine to make this organizational system. So if those conversations aren't necessarily being had, you're just, somewhat running on autopilot.
It sounds like it falls into we've always done it this way. We'll keep doing it the same way.
And as someone who's worked primarily or a lot in healthcare, there's high turnover. Typically, it's been around 2 years turnover time. And that's something you hear, well, it's just a high turnover job. But no one has seemed to stop and ask, why is it a high turnover job? What's leading into that? Are we not preparing? What is the system that makes it a high turnover job? What?
A saying that comes to mind is the glass ceiling.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know why you said, is this a high turnover job? I started thinking about women progress to a certain point and then they never progress anymore. And we've come to call that the glass ceiling. But before that term evolved and before we put awareness to that, the conversation was, there were all kinds of other explanations that were given to it. So you're talking about doing the same thing across different areas of the organization, where there seems to be, particularly when it comes to D&I, we're watching groups that don't progress past a certain point or aren't in certain types of roles or aren't given certain types of development opportunities that look at the data.
Yeah. And when you look at that, right, again, especially in something like accounting where it is so quantifiable and you can say, hey, you're able to do the job. Why isn't that represented on the other side of that ceiling, right? Where does the ceiling and the floor meet for some people?
Right.
And that's when we look at things or dissect that a little bit more and we can say, oh, well, women typically don't go into executive level or want a partner because, well, they're more focused on a family. Well, that's not true. They just happen to take the burden of that more than men do. There's plenty of men who also have families. There are plenty of single fathers who are working in high-level positions, but they don't have that bias or stereotype holding them back.
Right.
Oftentimes, they're supported or promoted to help with childcare or to find some other workaround. And it always, it goes back into, are we hiring the best people, or are we selecting the few and then working and encouraging them to become the best, right, based on some of these biases?
What's interesting about what you just said, particularly for men and childcare, is that we also know that when men do something like they get promoted, they're the single father, they're taking care of their kid, they get a big pat on the back, they get a bump for doing, going that extra mile and doing the hard work. But for a woman doing the exact same thing, well, of course, it's expected. There's no bump. And in fact, it could be something that holds her back. So that's a really good point. We're going to go into Q&A here. We also have another polling question. But before we do, you had a couple of other slides in here. And
I did.
If you want to just provide some, we don't have that much time, but provide some context for these.
Yeah. So this is from the Big Four. This is some of their latest D&I publications about where they stand. And this, to me, feels like a pretty strong representation of how systematic oppression works or is played out in the workforce, where you can clearly see the front line. The front line would be how many people are working at these companies. This is all US based, so they're US workforce altogether. And then the bars in the back are the partners. So you can see that for almost all of them, the front bars are higher, right? We have more representation in Black, Hispanic and Latin Americans, Asian, and even, you know, white people or people of two or more race, male to female, somewhat even. But then the number of those who become partners, they all drop. You can hardly see anyone in the back row who makes up a minority population. And for white people, it's definitely higher and across all boards. So this isn't, yeah. And someone may say, well, this is just the top 4. They're probably recruiting from the same schools. They're probably hiring some of those same interns. And in a way, that's what we're talking about, right? How much are you diversifying your talent? Now, the other bar chart I have there is a larger demographic, not just consisting of the big 4, but of everyone, right, in these accounting roles, or specifically as the CPAs, right? And again, you can see the same thing. How many people are enrolling into CPA programs? How many of them are graduating with that CPA, you know, and so then how many of them are actually moving up?
Students, those who pursue the actual license, and those who are hired into firms. I just want to make sure we have some time. So before we go any further, sorry, because we should have scheduled this for 2 hours. Lady Maya, can we do the third polling question? And while that's open, you can talk us. Let me go back one slide, because this is also a very interesting slide, the way you've presented it here. Oh, I don't know. Can you see it? It's the one with the columns where Deloitte, PwC, EY, and KPMG are in columns.
Yeah.
They can't see the slide
yet.
Oh,
okay. Sorry.
Because the poll's up.
We won't talk about the slide. But yeah, you were talking about the drop off. I thought that those visuals are very helpful because, you know, again, we're accountants. We like to be data driven. But the fact that those columns for men always go higher, and the columns are not for Caucasians always go up, and for for every other group they go down. It's very telling. And to your point, we need to be looking at the whys, not just the whats, and not to assume that there's got to be something in the system. In other words, I was thinking about it's got to be something in the water, but there's got to be something, and we just need to explore it a little bit more. So 39% said yes to the question, do you think the systems and structures in place are effective? 22% said no, and 38% said not sure. I'm encouraged by the 22% and the 38% because I understand the 39% think that they're effective, and I'm not saying they're not effective. I think what we can do is look at how they might be effective for different groups, and then consider, to our entire conversation, are there places we need to think about what the barriers are?
Yes. And yeah, I think it's 2-part, right? I think for those who are saying, yes, it is effective, you're right, it is effective. You're growing large organizations, companies are getting huge, and you're building upon, you know, what's already been there before, but also at the same time, you're building on the same things. And if we want to be strategic and we want to look at these business things for not so short term and really play them out in the long run, which some of the best organizations happen to implement these same DEI strategies, they just don't necessarily call them DE&I. And what they're doing is they're looking at, well, who are going to be our potential business partners? Who are someone who we may be interacting with in the future? Right. And a good example of this is, you know, right now, white people are the majority in the U.S. population, but that's slowly going down where Mexican Americans, Hispanic, Latins are definitely right up there. If not, I heard somewhere, but I didn't verify before talking to you today, that they're now one of the largest groups of minorities, and minorities together are going to pass up whites as the majority in this country. So from that angle, you can look at this data and understand that, well, if they're not going into partners, they're not working in some of these places, where are they going?
Right.
Well, a lot of them are entrepreneurs. They're using those skills and applying them in different ways to work with their own business, to work with small businesses. And strategically, you're missing out. Yeah, you're missing out on what could be clients, what could be possible really effective and really just real effective partners who can actually speak to the audience. They're going to be able to communicate. They have the same affinities. There's this common bond that is now, again, showing on one side of the workforce that we're having an increased number of minorities, and then the companies that are going to support those businesses or companies haven't yet made that shift.
Right. So their company, in this case, accounting firms, don't mirror the diversity of their clients, or increasingly that's going to be the case if accounting firms can't diversify their workforces. And to your point, the math is that there will be more and more minorities in the population. And if they're not going into accounting firms, by definition, the accounting workforce is going to have to constrict, just the math.
Well, and it already is. So the accounting for accountants, the demographics are decreasing. So there's 2% less this year than last year. People not only growing and building those businesses, or the business of accounting growing, but how many people are actually going into the school, getting that education that would actually put them out on the other side?
That's a fair point.
So already we're coming into this somewhat of a bottleneck where something has to be done. And that's going to be looking at things like, how do we recruit? How do we resource? If we know that 36% of CPAs become CFOs and 69% of them are promoted internally, well, where can we break that cycle? How can we expand that view to actually get more people into those upper positions? Because there's going to be the ones who are also looking at things from a different perspective, taking a different worldview, and actually able to, again, promote this business and keep things going, moving forward.
It's interesting you talked about that. There's a lot of conversation around recruiting. And so I think across the profession, firms and across the industry in general are recognizing we need to think differently about recruiting. We need to look very closely at those systems, those practices, those processes. But then what we're not really talking about is, all right, so we actually have hired in more diverse employees. We have a more diverse, what's the word? Entering class, if you will.
Yeah.
So the next set of systems are, how do we evaluate their performance? How do we provide leadership coaching, training, mentoring, sponsorship, advocacy, all the things that naturally occur because of the affinities that exclude those minority populations? Those are all systems that need to be reviewed. So I'm just throwing that out there. I'm going to throw some questions at you. We'll do the last polling question just as we wrap up Q&A. But so there are a lot of them that have come in. This isn't exactly on point, but it came in a long time ago, and I'm curious as well. Please explain the difference between Hispanic and Latino.
Well, so Hispanic typically refers to a people of origin who are actually conquered and taken over by people from Spain, and they typically carry the same language or tongue, which is Spanish. People who are Latin is actually a specific geographical location, South America, excluding Brazil. So when someone's Latin, they're from an actual place. Whereas if you're Hispanic, you can be Hispanic and Latin. You can be Hispanic and Mexican American. You can be Hispanic and Mexican based on, again, these terms that were given to us by other people. Right. And interestingly enough, like looking at Deloitte, they don't consider Hispanic or Latin as a race. So it's hard to, collect some of that data. They consider it an ethnicity. And again, when we talk about race, these are those visual profiles.
That's fascinating. And you excluded Brazil because in Brazil they speak Portuguese.
Yeah.
So there's a different view there. Good fit is substituted for qualifications. That's just a comment. That's what we're starting to do now, because before it was good fit, therefore they were good hire. And that was all based on confirmation bias, affinity bias, those kinds of things, where you went to my school, you have my skills, you look like me, we're in the same fraternity, we play the same sport. You must be a good, because I'm doing that and I'm good. So you're a good fit. That's sort of a jaded view, but that's like a very quick. Isn't the amount of partners, workers in public accounting directly correlated with the amount of accounting students? Maybe there should be more promotions of accounting degrees, as it is certainly hold on, I gotta scroll. Certainly a great career path to take, which is, so I'm realizing as I read this, you've touched on that before.
And there's a lot being done. There are places who are reaching out to affinity groups and minority affinity groups to say, hey, you guys are producing some of the same students we are, yet we're not hiring from your school versus this school. But the data again supports that, where minorities are going up, but the number of them who are being promoted hasn't really budged.
So here's an interesting comment. When asked to identify, I checked other and then answer Cajun American. And what's interesting about that is, as we start to explore the different dimensions of diversity, both race and ethnicity, where they're not necessarily the same and they sometimes overlap, we can start drilling in and recognizing that there are quite a number of differences that we bucket people in. So including Caucasians, by the way.
Absolutely.
Bucket people in simply by skin color rather than ethnicity, because African American is a term that some don't use. I don't use it. I say black because and some people say African means black, but what happens if you're in South Africa? Because there are white people in Africa, not just South Africa. Are they African?
Yeah, right. And that's where we go to nationality and things like that, where it's like, well, specifically, where's your passport from, right? what are those things? And it does get convoluted, and it's important, I think, to understand that everyone has their own race and their own racial story. But in the context of the workforce and the working world, when we default back to those same systems, or if we view something as race, just understand that that's one level. Up from the race card, right? It happens with cultural and religions, and then it goes to gender, and then it may go to ability if you have a disability, or ableism is what we call it. Gender identification, age, socioeconomic status. And if we don't pay attention to these things, what happens is we start removing one or two off things, right? So we're all the same race, we're all the same sex. Well, how else are we defaulting back to some of these same systems? So if you don't fit that archetype of, hey, I'm also white, I went to this grade school, it's not this school. It's not what you did an intern at one of the big fours. That's cool. We did, right? So this is the reason why it extends beyond, but it starts, unfortunately, it starts with race. It starts with those visual, easy to go to biases.
So there was a question in here exactly that when we talk about diversity. So that, Jeanette, I think that answered your question. I'm looking at the time. We have maybe a minute left. That one I don't think we can answer. So Patricia, I see your question here about recommending sources, and I'll try to follow up with you offline. What about, okay, I don't even know if you can do this in a minute, but what about measuring overcoming adversity as a selection criterion or proof of success in diverse environment?
Yeah, I think, that would be a little bit harder to set up and measure. And just because we'd have to really take some qualitative measures that we'd be able to apply consistently, right? But again, we want to look at skills-based hiring. We want to look at competency-based hiring, because those things are going to be able to capture and say, hey, here's an example of where I've been able to prove that I'm able to do this work. And here's why I want to do this work. I love that the first question you even asked me was, why do you do this thing? And the funny thing is I believe it was Deloitte when they polled some of the top 100 companies, I think they got 80 of them, 80% came back and they all identified two things, right? Can you do the job and how passionate about it are you? Those are the two best predictors of success. You have a displayed example that you can complete these tasks or do this job and you're passionate enough to keep doing it.
Right.
There's not much else there. There's no race. There's no, the way you look, what school you came from. It's literally, hey, if we have this organization and system with a common goal,
right.
Well, what's going to put us in the best position to actually achieve that goal? And that's sometimes reviewing the organization systems that they're built upon.
Right. Which is the whole point of this conversation, understanding that we can't just make this about everybody overcoming their biases, because we're human. Right. We won't overcome bias. We can just increase awareness.
Exactly.
Or make a people thing. We just want people to be happier here as an employee experience. We also have to look at the systems embedded in organizations. So thank you.
Yeah, and we can change those, and we can do it consistently across the board.
Well, thank you. Before we wrap up, I just want to invite everybody, this is a biweekly webinar series every other Friday at 3. And that my next conversation is with Sasha Thompson. And we're specifically going to be looking at identities, like understanding individual identities, which is fascinating, especially following this conversation. And you were talking about, once we start taking them away or combining people into similar groups, where are we without understanding those identities? So I hope everyone joins us. We'll do the last polling question and then wrap up. And before then, thank you, Angelo. I appreciate you being here.
Yes, thank you for your time. Thank you for allowing me to, speak on these. And it's such a large topic. It's so hard to get it condensed down into an hour.
Right.
But it's definitely important.
Oh, I saw somebody asked, is there a fourth polling question? Ta-da! Yes. Usually save that one to the end. My understanding is that my understanding of Latin is anybody whose language comes from Latin. That will include Brazil and many countries in Europe that speak Latin languages. So that's interesting.
And that's a part of it. And I think, again, part of these descriptors and the way that we identify people, again, is, outward looking in as a way to categorize and compartmentalize someone. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but depending on how you're using it, could have a different result.
So let's see, 42% learned something new. And I always appreciate the honesty. 18% were here for the CPE. Ta-da! Listen, I've done my share of that. I'm a CPA. I got to maintain my license. So thank you. And with that, I think, Lady Maya, we have to hand it back to you.
All right, thanks so much. We're going to go ahead and get ready to wrap up with today's webinar. We here at CPA Academy will process credit later today. That'll be available in your CPA Academy accounts within 24 hours. Everyone will have an opportunity for a full webinar evaluation. Those links to the evaluation are available in your CPA Academy accounts as well as your email. Thanks again to our wonderful speakers on this great conversation, Jina and the one and only Angelo. So thanks everyone for your participation and time. We urge you to take a look at your CPA Academy My Account page and see all the resources that we made available to you there. To take a look at the other fantastic webinars we were able to offer. We hope to see you all in future webinars and hope you have a great rest of the day. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.